I found something I've been looking for my whole life. That's what he said. Late at night. Over the phone to his wife. His voice, and I've listened to enough Coburn interviews to hear it in my head, that low, gravel-bottom drawl that made him famous. The voice that had delivered lines to Yul Brynner, traded quips with Dean Martin, sold 1 million movie tickets with a single raised eyebrow. That voice, at midnight, cracking at the edges with something his wife had never heard in it before. Not excitement. Not enthusiasm. Those are surface words, and whatever had happened to James Coburn that evening lived deeper than surfaces. Wonder. That's the closest word. The wonder of a man who has spent 20 years looking for a thing he couldn't name and has just, in a small room on a side street in Los Angeles, found it standing in front of him. 5'7". 135 pounds. Wearing a simple black shirt and an expression that contained no performance whatsoever. I found something I've been looking for my whole life. His wife asked him what he meant. He couldn't explain. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The thing he'd seen in that room had no vocabulary in the language he shared with the world. He was an actor. His profession was the precise deployment of words, gestures, expressions to create a predetermined effect. And the thing he'd just witnessed was the opposite of all that. It was unperformable. It was real. I've been researching Bruce Lee for 2 years now. In the last story I told you, a man stood in a backstage corridor and watched something that lasted 10 seconds. He didn't flinch. He didn't intervene. He put his hands in his pockets and walked away. 2 weeks later, he picked up a phone and dialed a number that someone in the martial arts community had given him, and he asked for private lessons, and he offered $275 an hour. $275 per hour. In 1967. Let me put that in context. In 1967, the average American household income was roughly $7,800 per year. Per year. Coburn was offering more than 3% of that for a single hour. 2 sessions a week, which is what he eventually settled into, would cost $550 a week. $2,200 a month. Over $26,000 a year. More than 3 times what the average family lived on. For martial arts lessons. From a man nobody in Hollywood had heard of. This is the story of that phone call and everything that came after it. Not a fight story, nobody gets hit in this one. No one ends up on a concrete floor. The drama here is quieter and, I think, more dangerous. Because the thing that happened between James Coburn and Bruce Lee in 1967 wasn't a confrontation. It was an education. And the most threatening thing in the world isn't a fist you can't see coming. It's an idea you can't unsee once it arrives. There's a moment in the first lesson, something Bruce did that had nothing to do with punching or kicking or any of the things Coburn expected, that I believe is the key to the entire relationship. The key to why Coburn paid what he paid, kept coming back, endured Hollywood's laughter, and never once felt the need to explain himself. But to understand that moment, you need to understand the 2 men who were in the room. Who they were before they found each other. Because this is a story about 2 people, and the distance between them measured in fame, in race, in size, in the brutal social physics of 1960s America was so vast that the fact they ended up in the same room at all is its own kind of miracle. Let me start with the one the world could see. James Coburn was born in Laurel, Nebraska, in 1928. If you don't know where Laurel, Nebraska is, that's because almost nobody does. It's a small town in the northeast corner of the state, flat and windscoured and honest in the way that places with no reason to lie tend to be. His father worked odd jobs. His mother held the family together the way mothers in the Depression held families together, with stubbornness and math and the kind of daily courage that never gets called courage because it doesn't look dramatic enough for the word. Coburn grew up tall. That was the first thing anyone noticed about him, and it would be the first thing anyone noticed about him for the rest of his life. By 16, he was over 6 feet. By 20, he was 6'3". He had a frame that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood load-bearing structures, wide shoulders, long arms, a torso that tapered to narrow hips. His face was all angles. Jaw, cheekbones, brow each one looked like it had been started by a sculptor who believed in straight lines and didn't trust curves. It was not a handsome face in the conventional sense. It was a compelling face. A face that cameras understood even when audiences weren't sure what they were looking at. He served in the army. Korea. He doesn't talk about it much in interviews, and I've learned to respect the silence of men who served and chose not to narrate it. What he brought back was something harder to name than a medal or a scar, a physical self-awareness. A relationship with his own body that was informed by the knowledge that bodies can fail, can be damaged, can stop working in an instant. He moved, after Korea, with the economy of a man who understood that movement has consequences. Hollywood found him in the late 50s. Or he found Hollywood. The direction of discovery depends on who's telling the story. He arrived in Los Angeles with no connections, no money, and no plan beyond the general conviction that his face and his voice and his 6'3" frame might be worth something in a town that bought and sold exactly those commodities. The early years were lean. Bit parts. Television westerns where he played the third cowboy from the left, the one who delivers 2 lines and gets shot in the second act. He studied acting with Stella Adler, which tells you something about his seriousness. He wasn't a hobbyist. He wasn't a pretty face hoping to drift into success. He was a craftsman. He approached acting the way a carpenter approaches joinery, with precision, with patience, with respect for the material. Then The Magnificent Seven. 1960. John Sturges directing. Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, Coburn, a roster that reads like a who's who of men whose jawlines could cut glass. Coburn played Britt, the knife expert. He didn't have the most lines. He didn't have the biggest role. But he had a scene, the knife versus gun scene, that became one of the most iconic moments in Western cinema. He threw a knife. He threw it once. And the way he threw it, the stillness before, the precision during, the calm after, announced to Hollywood that this man understood something about controlled violence that most actors were only pretending to understand. After that, the trajectory was steep. The Great Escape. Our Man Flint, a spy franchise that positioned Coburn as America's answer to James Bond, but taller and with better comedic timing. By 1967, he was one of the most bankable tough guys in the industry. Not the biggest star, that was a shifting title, passed between McQueen and Newman and Eastwood depending on the year. But consistently present. Consistently credible. Consistently the man you cast when you needed someone who looked like he could actually do the things the script said he could do. And here's the thing about Coburn that matters for this story, he did his own stunts. Not all of them, no insurance company in California would have allowed that. But more than most. He insisted on it. Not out of vanity, out of a specific, almost obsessive commitment to physical authenticity. He studied how bodies moved. He trained with stunt coordinators, learning their craft from the inside. He worked with boxers, fencers, judo practitioners. He was, in the vocabulary of 1960s Hollywood, a man who knew how to move. But he knew, and this is the crack in the foundation, the hairline fracture that would eventually lead him to Bruce Lee's door, that everything he knew was choreography. It was beautiful choreography. Convincing choreography. The kind of choreography that made audiences lean forward in their seats and believe, for 2 hours, that the punches were real and the falls were dangerous and the violence had weight. But it was performance. Every punch was pre-planned. Every fall was rehearsed. Every moment of apparent danger was, in fact, the safest thing in the room because it had been engineered to look dangerous while being completely controlled. Coburn knew the difference between performance and reality. He'd been in Korea. He'd seen what real violence looked like, sudden, ugly, unchoreographed, without camera angles or dramatic music or the certainty that the hero would stand up in the next scene. And the knowledge that his professional life was built on the beautiful imitation of a thing he'd seen the ugly original of created a hunger in him. A low, persistent appetite for authenticity that Hollywood couldn't satisfy. He'd looked for it. In dojos, in gyms, in the dusty backrooms where old boxers trained young ones. He'd found skill. He'd found tradition. He'd found discipline. But he hadn't found the thing. The thing that would make him feel the way he'd felt in Korea, not the fear, not the trauma, but the aliveness. The absolute, electric clarity of a moment where performance is impossible because there's no audience and no second take and the body is doing what it does without consulting the script. He was looking for something real. He just didn't know where to find it. Now. The other man. The one the world couldn't see. Bruce Lee in 1967 was 27 years old. He was living in Los Angeles with his wife, Linda, and their young son, Brandon. He was teaching martial arts. And by almost every metric that mattered in the city he lived in, he was nobody. Let me be specific about what nobody meant in Los Angeles in 1967 if you were a young Chinese man. It meant that casting directors looked through you. Not at you, through you. As if you were a window and the interesting thing was on the other side. Bruce had done The Green Hornet, a television show where he played Kato, the sidekick. The mask-wearing, car-driving, barely speaking sidekick. The role required him to be extraordinary and invisible simultaneously. His fight scenes were the most dynamic thing on the show, and his character was the most forgettable. He was there to make the white lead look good. That was the architecture of the role, and Bruce knew it, and he took it because the alternative was not being on television at all. The show was cancelled after one season. 26 episodes. And when it ended, the phone stopped ringing with a completeness that had its own kind of silence, not a gradual fade but a clean cut, as if someone had found the wire that connected Bruce Lee to the entertainment industry and snipped it with pliers. He auditioned. He was told he was too Chinese. Not in those words, Hollywood had already learned the vocabulary of polite exclusion. Not the right fit. We're going in a different direction. The audience isn't ready. Translation: you are Asian, and this is America, and the roles available to you are waiter, laundryman, villain with an accent, or nothing. Bruce was offered nothing and chose it over the alternatives. So he taught. In a small space in Los Angeles that generous descriptions called a school and honest descriptions called a room. It had mirrors along one wall. A wooden Wing Chun dummy in the corner, a vertical wooden post with protruding arms, used for trapping and striking practice, smooth from years of contact. The floor was clean. The equipment was minimal. The space smelled of wood and sweat and the faint lemon scent of floor polish. He taught a handful of private students. He charged fees that were modest by any standard, let alone the standard he would later command. He was developing something Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, though the name hadn't fully solidified yet. What had solidified was the principle: strip everything unnecessary from martial arts. No tradition for tradition's sake. No ceremony without function. No movement that doesn't serve a purpose. Find what works. Discard what doesn't. Be like water. He read voraciously. Philosophy, Eastern and Western. Biomechanics. Fencing theory. He was fascinated by fencing, by its emphasis on timing. Distance, and the straight line as the shortest path between 2 points. Boxing manuals. Psychology. He was building a system from first principles, and first principles don't care about tradition or nationality or the expectations of the culture you happen to live in. First principles care about what works. In that small room, on any given day, Bruce Lee was the most dangerous man in Los Angeles. This is not hyperbole. His speed had been measured strikes faster than cameras could record. His power, concentrated through a body that was 135 pounds of precisely engineered muscle with virtually no body fat, was disproportionate to his size in a way that biomechanics researchers would spend decades trying to explain. His understanding of combat, real combat, not choreographed combat, was so far ahead of his contemporaries that the gap wasn't a gap. It was a canyon. And nobody knew. Not nobody in the absolute sense. His students knew, the small martial arts community knew, the people who'd been at that backstage corridor knew. But Hollywood didn't know. The industry that manufactured and sold images of physical power had, standing within its borders, the most physically capable human being most of them would ever encounter, and it could not see him. Because he was 5'7". Because he weighed 135 pounds. Because his name was Lee and his face was Chinese, and the filing system of 1967 America had no folder for small Asian man who was extraordinary. I want you to hold those two portraits in your mind, side by side, because the distance between them is the engine of this story. James Coburn, 6'3", famous, wealthy, powerful, the embodiment of Hollywood masculinity. A man who walked into rooms and the rooms rearranged themselves around him. A man whose face had been projected onto screens 40 feet tall and whose voice had been heard by millions. The most visible tough man in American cinema. Bruce Lee, 5'7", unknown, struggling, invisible to the industry that surrounded him. A man who walked into casting offices and was looked through like glass. A man whose abilities exceeded anything Hollywood had ever put on screen, and whose phone didn't ring. The most invisible, dangerous man in Los Angeles. One had everything except the real thing. The other had the real thing and almost nothing else. In 1967, the man with everything drove to the side street where the man with nothing taught in a small room. He parked his car, and I like to think about what car it was, though I don't know for certain. Something expensive. Something that looked out of place on that street the way Coburn himself was about to look out of place in that room. He sat in the car for a moment. I'm speculating here, I have no witness account for this, no interview, no documentation. But I've spent enough time with Coburn's interviews to understand his temperament, and I think he sat. Not from hesitation. From recalibration. The exterior of Bruce's school did not match the price tag. $275 an hour should buy marble floors and a reception desk and someone offering you sparkling water. It should buy visible evidence of its own value. Instead, it bought a plain door on a quiet street and the understanding that whatever was inside had to be experienced rather than displayed. He got out. He walked to the door. He opened it. The room was small. Smaller than Coburn expected, smaller than his trailer on a film set, smaller than his walk-in closet at home. Mirrors along one wall reflected the space back on itself, creating the illusion of more room while simultaneously making it impossible to hide. The wooden dummy stood in the corner like a strange, armless sentinel. The floor was bare, clean, slightly warm from the afternoon sun that came through a high window. The light was natural, no fluorescence here, not like the backstage corridor. Daylight, filtered through glass, catching the dust motes that drifted in the still air. Bruce was already there. Not warming up, not stretching, not punching a bag. Standing. In the center of the room. Hands at his sides. The same stillness Coburn had seen in the corridor 2 weeks earlier, that eerie, settled, total stillness that looked like inactivity and was, in fact, the opposite. The stillness of a man whose awareness filled the room the way water fills a glass, completely, without effort, without empty space. He was wearing a simple black shirt. Dark pants. No uniform, no belt system, no visible insignia of rank or style. He looked like a man who had gotten dressed without thinking about it because what he wore was irrelevant to what he could do. They shook hands. I want to pause on this handshake because I think it's the first moment where Coburn's world tilted. Coburn was 6'3". Bruce was 5'7". In every room Coburn had ever entered, being the taller man was a form of authority and unearned, automatic advantage that he hadn't asked for but had certainly used. You look down at people, and the geometry of that gaze carries dominance whether you intend it or not. He looked down at Bruce Lee. And the room didn't cooperate. The geometry said Coburn was taller. Everything else said Bruce was the center of gravity. It wasn't aggression. Bruce didn't puff up, didn't posture, didn't do any of the things that smaller men sometimes do in the presence of larger ones. He was simply, completely, unperformably present. He occupied his 5'7" the way most people don't occupy 6'3". He filled it. Coburn felt, and I'm extrapolating from fragments of interviews, from the way he described Bruce in later years, from the texture of his language when he talked about that period, that he had walked into someone else's room. Not someone else's house. Someone else's room. The room belonged to Bruce not because his name was on the lease but because the air in it seemed to organize itself around him. They talked briefly. Bruce didn't bow. didn't perform the Eastern deference that Western students of Asian martial arts expected and, in some cases, demanded the ritual that said, "I am the exotic other and you are the honored student and let us both play our assigned roles." Bruce shook his hand like a man meeting another man. Eye contact. Direct. A grip that was neither aggressive nor deferential. And in that grip, Coburn felt something, the density. Bruce's hand was not large, but it was dense in a way that hands aren't supposed to be. The muscles, the tendons, the architecture of a hand that had been trained and conditioned to be a weapon, it was like shaking hands with a thing carved from hardwood. And then Bruce did something Coburn didn't expect. He didn't start with a demonstration. Didn't throw a kick at a pad. Didn't break a board. Didn't do any of the things that martial arts instructors in 1967 did when a new student walked in the showy stuff, the impressive stuff, the stuff designed to justify the price. He said, "Try to touch me." Not hit. Not strike. Touch. As if the distance between intention and contact was the entire lesson, and the lesson had already started. Coburn, amused, and I think the amusement is important, because it's the last moment of his old framework, the final second before the paradigm shifted, reached for Bruce's shoulder. A casual reach. Not a punch, not a grab. Just a hand moving toward his shoulder, the way you might tap someone to get their attention. Bruce wasn't there. Not in a dramatic way. There was no backflip, no spinning evasion, no martial arts movie moment where the defender leaps 6 feet backward and lands in a crouch. Bruce moved, but the movement was so small, so minimal, so precisely calibrated to the exact vector of Coburn's reach that it barely qualified as movement. An inch. Maybe 2. The displacement of a man who knew exactly how much space he needed to vacate and refused to waste a millimeter more. Coburn's hand closed on air. On the place where a shoulder had been and now was not. The experience was disorienting, not because it was fast, though it was, but because it was efficient in a way that violated Coburn's 15 years of studying how bodies move. In the movies, evasion was dramatic. It was a performance. The hero dodges with style. With flair, with an excess of motion that signals to the audience, "Look how agile I am." What Bruce had just done was the opposite. It was the minimum. The absolute, mathematically precise minimum displacement necessary to make a hand grasp nothing. Coburn tried again. Faster this time. More committed. He was a man who trained with stunt coordinators, boxers, fencers. He knew how to close distance. He knew how to make a hand arrive at a target. He reached, and Bruce moved, and the result was the same. Air. Nothing. The shoulder, 2 inches from where it had been, which was exactly 2 inches from where the hand arrived. It was like trying to touch water. You push the surface and the surface gives way, not in resistance but in acceptance. It moves because that is what it does. It doesn't fight your hand. It simply isn't where your hand expects it to be. 3 times. 4 times. Each time Coburn faster, more deliberate, adjusting his approach, using the things he'd learned from 15 years of choreographed combat. Each time Bruce displacing by the minimum. Never retreating. Never creating distance. Just editing the space between them with a precision that made Coburn feel not slow, he wasn't slow, but legible. Transparent. As if his body was a book written in a language he didn't know Bruce could read. And then Bruce stopped moving. He stood still and he explained. Your right shoulder dropped 2 inches before your hand moved. Coburn blinked. Your weight shifted to your left foot a quarter second before you reached. I felt it through the floor. Coburn said nothing. Your eyes moved to my shoulder, to the target, before your arm did. You looked where you were going to touch. You told me 3 times what you were going to do before you did it. Your shoulder told me. Your weight told me. Your eyes told me. Silence. The kind that doesn't feel empty. The kind that feels full over full, pressurized, a room containing more information than it had a minute ago and the air adjusting to accommodate it. Coburn had worked with the best stunt coordinators in Hollywood. He had spent years studying how bodies move on screen. He had trained with boxers who could read a jab, fencers who could read a lunge, wrestlers who could feel a shift in balance through the grip of a hand. None of them, not one, had ever described human movement this way. Not as choreography. Not as technique. As language. As a text written in muscle and weight and the involuntary architecture of intention, a text that could be read by someone who knew the alphabet. Bruce wasn't fast. That wasn't the lesson. Speed was part of it. Bruce was the fastest human being Coburn had ever seen, and Coburn had seen a lot of fast human beings. But speed was the least interesting part. The interesting part was the reading. Bruce could see what your body was going to do before your body did it. Not through mysticism, not through some exotic Eastern power. Through observation. Through an understanding of biomechanics so granular, so specific, so far beyond what anyone in Coburn's world had achieved, that it looked like prediction when it was, in fact, perception. Then Bruce showed him something else. I don't know exactly what this was. The accounts are secondhand, filtered through decades. What I have is Coburn's language about it, fragments scattered across interviews from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the language circles the same idea without ever quite landing on a concrete description. He talks about force. He talks about generation. He talks about watching Bruce produce power from a position that shouldn't have been able to produce power. Here's my best reconstruction. Bruce stood in a neutral position, feet close together, arms relaxed, weight centered. No wind-up. No chamber. No preparatory movement of any kind. And from that stillness, he moved, and the movement generated force. Visible force. Force that Coburn could feel in the air, or see in the impact on a pad, or register in the displacement of a target. It came from nowhere, or rather, it came from everywhere simultaneously. From the floor through the feet, through the legs, through the hip, through the torso, through the arm. A kinetic chain so seamless that it looked like a single event rather than a sequence. Like a whip crack that starts at the handle and arrives at the tip as sound. Coburn had studied movement his entire professional life. He understood leverage, torque, the mechanics of a punch, the physics of a kick. What Bruce had just shown him violated none of those principles, but it revealed that the textbook Coburn had been reading was a primer. A children's version. An introduction to a subject that went deeper than he had imagined, and Bruce was standing at a depth that Coburn hadn't known existed. I need to pause here because there's a problem with reconstructing private lessons that happened nearly 60 years ago. I don't have video. I don't have a first-hand account from inside the room. What I have is Coburn's public reflections, guarded, fragmented, delivered with the economy of a man who understood that some experiences lose their truth when you describe them in detail, and Bruce's own writings about his teaching methodology, which give me the principles but not the specific moments. I'm building this scene from scaffolding, not from blueprints. The emotional architecture is solid. The specific details are my best reconstruction, and I'm telling you that openly because I'd rather be honest about uncertainty than confident about fiction. What I do know, what the record supports without ambiguity, is the effect. Coburn left that first lesson different from how he'd arrived. Not visibly. He was still 6'3", still famous, still driving an expensive car back to an expensive house. The change was internal. Structural. Like a building that looks the same from the outside but has had its foundation replaced. He drove home. He ate dinner with his wife. He was quiet. She would later describe his mood that evening, though the exact quote has been paraphrased through multiple sources, so I'll give you the sense rather than the words. He was present but somewhere else simultaneously. His body was at the dinner table. His mind was in a small room with mirrors and a wooden dummy and a man who had just shown him that the thing he'd been looking for, the real thing, the thing beyond choreography, beyond performance, beyond the beautiful lie of movie violence, existed. It was real. And it lived in the last place Hollywood would have fought to look. Late that night, he called his wife into the room. And he said the words I started this story with. I found something I've been looking for my whole life. He couldn't explain what it was. She asked, and he tried, and the words came out sideways, descriptions of movement, of speed, of a feeling in the room. None of it captured the thing. Because the thing wasn't a technique or a trick or a demonstration. The thing was the experience of being in the presence of someone who had achieved a level of mastery so complete that it redefined the word. Not mastery as domination. Mastery as clarity. The clarity of a man who had stripped away everything unnecessary and was left standing in the center of a room with nothing but what worked. $275 an hour. Coburn would pay it twice a week for years. And he would never, in all that time, feel that he was overpaying. Weeks passed. Coburn came back. Every Tuesday. Every Friday. $275, placed in an envelope, left on a small wooden shelf near the door. Bruce never counted it in front of him. Never acknowledged the transaction beyond a brief nod. The money was a fact, like the floor or the mirrors or the wooden dummy in the corner. It existed. It was not the point. The lessons followed no curriculum that Coburn could identify. There was no belt system, no progression chart, no sense that Lesson 12 built on Lesson 11 in a way that could be mapped on a whiteboard. Bruce taught the way water erodes stone, not in a straight line, not according to a schedule, but persistently, from every angle, finding the cracks in Coburn's understanding and widening them until the old structure gave way. Some days were physical. Bruce would have Coburn throw punches, not movie punches, real ones. Or as close to real as Coburn could manage. And then Bruce would disassemble the punch. Not criticize it, disassemble it. Your elbow flares at the top of the arc. That costs you 3 inches of reach and a quarter second of time. Your hip rotates after your shoulder, it should rotate before. The power starts in the floor, not in the arm. You're generating force from the middle of the chain. That's like trying to crack a whip by shaking the middle. Some days were conceptual. Bruce would talk about centerline theory, the idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and that all efficient strikes travel along or toward the centerline of the body. He would talk about economy of motion, the principle that every movement should serve a purpose, and any movement that doesn't serve a purpose is a movement that costs you time, energy, and tactical advantage. He would talk about the difference between reacting and intercepting, between waiting for an attack and meeting it before it fully forms, catching the intention in its infancy. Coburn, who had spent 15 years learning how to make violence look convincing on camera, was now learning how to make violence actual. The distance between those two things was greater than he had imagined. Movie fighting was additive, you added drama, added style, added excess motion to signal to the audience that something important was happening. Real fighting, as Bruce taught it, was subtractive. You removed everything that wasn't necessary. You pared the movement down to its functional minimum. What was left didn't look dramatic. It looked almost boring, a small, precise motion that traveled a short distance and arrived at its target before the target knew it had been sent. That's the problem with movies, Bruce told him once, and this is paraphrased from a second-hand account, but the sentiment appears in multiple sources. Movies teach people that fighting is big. Wide punches. Flying kicks. Spinning. All of that is waste. A real fight is small. The smaller, the better. The best technique is the one the other person doesn't see, not because it's hidden, but because it's finished before their eyes can process it. Coburn absorbed this. Not easily. His body had 15 years of movie habits wired into its muscles, and muscles don't forget just because the mind has decided to learn something new. He would throw a punch and Bruce would stop him. Smaller. He would throw it again. Smaller. Again. Your shoulder is still telegraphing. Your chin is lifting. You're performing the punch. Stop performing it. Just throw it. Stop performing it. Just throw it. For a man whose entire career was performance, this instruction was not merely technical. It was existential. Bruce was asking Coburn to unlearn the thing that had made him successful. To strip away the habits that had earned him millions of dollars and the admiration of audiences worldwide. To stand in a small room and be bad at something genuinely, uncomfortably bad in service of eventually being real at it. And Coburn did it. Week after week. $275 at a time. He stood in that room and threw punches that Bruce disassembled and rebuilt. He practiced footwork that felt awkward after years of choreographed movement. He learned to read bodies, not with Bruce's supernatural fluency, but with a beginner's halting literacy, seeing telegraphs he'd never noticed, feeling weight shifts through the floor, understanding that every human being broadcasts their intentions continuously and that most people never learn to listen. The lessons weren't always serious. Bruce had a sense of humor that surprised people who expected a martial arts master to be solemn. He would demonstrate a technique at full speed, a blur, a sound, a target pad jumping in Coburn's hands, and then grin and say something like, "Don't worry. You'll be able to do that in about 40 years. Coburn, who had spent his career surrounded by people who were too intimidated or too strategic to joke with him, found himself laughing in that small room in a way he didn't laugh on film sets. The humor was real. Like everything else in that room. Unperformed. I spent weeks trying to find a single instance where Coburn publicly justified his training with Bruce during the 1960s. A single interview, a single quote, a single moment where he turned to a skeptic and said, "Let me tell you why." I couldn't find one. Not one. He didn't argue with the doubters. He didn't bring them to a lesson. He didn't demonstrate what he'd learned at parties or on set. He simply continued. Tuesday. Friday. The envelope on the shelf. The small room. The mirrors and the wooden dummy and the man who was teaching him a new language for his own body. There's a confidence in that silence, or maybe a privacy, that I find remarkable. Coburn knew what he had. He knew it the way you know the temperature of bathwater or the weight of your own hand, not through argument, not through evidence, but through contact. He had touched the real thing. He didn't need anyone else to confirm that it was warm. Because Hollywood was talking. The machinery of gossip in 1960s Los Angeles was efficient in the way that all closed systems are efficient. Information moved fast, changed shape as it moved, and arrived at its destination bearing only a passing resemblance to the truth. The truth was that James Coburn was taking private martial arts lessons from a highly skilled instructor and paying a premium for the privilege. What arrived at cocktail parties and studio lunches was something else. Coburn's got a guru. That word guru did a lot of work in 1960s Hollywood. It was code. It meant someone has lost their grip on reality. Someone has been seduced by the exotic, the mystical, the oriental. It conjured images of incense and meditation and a white man sitting cross-legged on the floor while a small Asian man spoke in fortune cookie wisdom. It reduced whatever Coburn was doing to a cliché, the Western seeker and the Eastern mystic, a story Hollywood had been telling about itself since it discovered that Buddhism existed and could be photographed. The irony was precise and total. The people laughing at Coburn were people who made their living staging fake fights, choreographed, rehearsed, shot from angles designed to hide the fact that no one was actually hitting anyone. They were people who had never been in a real confrontation, never felt the adrenal dump of genuine physical threat, never experienced the difference between performing violence and encountering it. They were laughing at a man who had found the real thing, and they were laughing because they had no frame of reference for what the real thing looked like. He's paying how much? $275 an hour. That number circulated through Hollywood like a virus. It was repeated at agency lunches, at production meetings, in the back seats of cars heading to premieres. Always with the same inflection, disbelief laced with a very specific kind of anxiety. Because $275 an hour wasn't just an extravagant price. It was an assertion of value. It said, the person I am paying this to is worth this. And if James Coburn, a man whose judgment Hollywood respected, whose instincts had been validated by a decade of box office success, believed that a small Chinese martial arts instructor was worth $275 an hour, then either Coburn was wrong, or Hollywood was missing something. And Hollywood did not enjoy the possibility that it was missing something. So it laughed. The safe response. The response that required no investigation, no vulnerability, no admission that the world might contain things you don't understand. Laughter, in Hollywood, was a defense mechanism disguised as confidence. It said, I know what's valuable and this isn't it. It said, the system I live in is correct, and anything outside that system is a joke. Coburn heard all of it. He heard it in the specific way that famous people hear gossip, not directly, not to his face, but in the altered texture of conversations. In the half-second pause before someone changed the subject. In the slightly too bright smiles of colleagues who had been talking about him 30 seconds earlier. He felt it in the way that certain invitations became less frequent, certain phone calls shorter, certain handshakes fractionally less warm. Hollywood's disapproval was never overt. It was atmospheric. A shift in pressure that you couldn't point to but couldn't ignore. He didn't respond. He went to his next lesson. And this is where the story turns. Not with a dramatic event. Not with a confrontation or a revelation or a moment of crisis. It turns with repetition. With the quiet, undramatic accumulation of Tuesdays and Fridays, of envelopes on shelves, of punches thrown and disassembled and rebuilt, of a man slowly and patiently unlearning the performance of strength and beginning to understand the practice of it. Months passed. The lessons continued. And something began to change, not in Coburn's technique, though that was changing too. Something in the room itself. In the space between the two men. In the quality of the silence when Bruce corrected and Coburn adjusted and neither of them spoke for 30 seconds while a new movement was practiced. The power dynamic was extraordinary. I keep coming back to this because I think it's the beating heart of the story. In every other room in James Coburn's life, he was the authority. On set, directors consulted him about action sequences. Stunt coordinators deferred to his preferences. Producers accommodated his schedule, his demands, his vision. At parties, he was the gravitational center, the man whose stories people gathered to hear, whose opinions shaped conversations, whose approval was silently sought and whose disapproval was quietly feared. He was 6'3". He was famous. He was rich. He was, by every metric that 1960s America used to measure male power, at the top. In Bruce Lee's small room, he was none of those things. He was a student. He stood where Bruce told him to stand. He moved how Bruce told him to move. When Bruce said again, he did it again. When Bruce said wrong, he accepted it. When Bruce demonstrated a technique at a speed that Coburn couldn't follow and then waited for Coburn to attempt it at a speed that Bruce could have intercepted while reading a newspaper, Coburn attempted it without embarrassment. He was taking instruction from a man who was younger than him. Smaller than him. Less famous than him by an almost unmeasurable margin. Less wealthy, less connected, less powerful by every standard that the world they both inhabited used to determine hierarchy. Bruce Lee was, in the social physics of 1967 Los Angeles, everything that James Coburn was not. Asian in a white industry. Small in a world that valued size. Unknown in a city that valued fame. Poor, or at least not rich, in a culture that used wealth as a proxy for worth. And twice a week, the most powerful white man in Hollywood bowed. Not physically, Bruce didn't require bowing. But functionally. Structurally. In the architecture of their interaction, Coburn was the student and Bruce was the master, and this reversal was so complete, so unperformed, so natural in the small room with the mirrors and the wooden dummy that neither man seemed to notice it was extraordinary. It was simply the truth of the space. Bruce knew things that Coburn didn't. Coburn wanted to learn them. The rest, the fame, the money, the race, the size, was noise. And in that room, the noise was turned off. The relationship changed Bruce too. Not in the obvious way. Bruce's confidence in his own abilities was, by every account, absolute. It didn't waver based on who was or wasn't in the room. He didn't need James Coburn to validate his skill any more than a river needs someone to confirm that it's flowing. He was what he was. He knew what he knew. External recognition was pleasant but unnecessary. But Coburn represented something else. Something strategic. Something that mattered not to Bruce's ego but to his understanding of what was possible. Coburn was proof that the wall had a door. The wall between Bruce Lee and Hollywood, the wall built from casting decisions and racial assumptions and the industry's absolute conviction that American audiences would not accept an Asian leading man, was real. It was thick. It was defended by the institutional inertia of an entire industry. Bruce had been hitting that wall for years, and the wall had not moved. But Coburn was on the other side of it. Coburn was inside the system, one of the system's most successful products, in fact, and Coburn had come to Bruce. Not the other way around. Bruce hadn't lobbied for this. Hadn't marketed himself to Hollywood power brokers. Hadn't compromised his teaching or softened his style to make it more palatable to Western expectations. He had simply been what he was, in a small room, with absolute commitment, and someone on the inside had seen him. That mattered. Not because Bruce needed approval, he didn't. But because it proved a hypothesis he'd been developing about how change works. You don't storm the wall. You don't scream at it. You become so undeniably, specifically, demonstrably real that the wall becomes irrelevant. You don't go through it. Someone on the other side opens a door and invites you in. Coburn was the first door. He wouldn't be the last. Because Coburn started talking. Not publicly, he never justified his training to the gossip machine, never held a press conference, never issued a statement. But privately, to specific people, in specific contexts, he began to mention Bruce Lee's name. Not as advocacy. Not as a campaign. As simple testimony. The testimony of a man who had experienced something genuine and could not, in good conscience, keep it entirely to himself. He mentioned Bruce to a screenwriter named Sterling Siliphant. Siliphant was a serious man, an Academy Award winner, a professional whose work ethic matched Coburn's and whose appetite for authenticity exceeded it. Coburn didn't tell Siliphant what to do. He told him what he'd experienced. And Siliphant, who trusted Coburn's judgment the way you trust the judgment of someone who has never once recommended something that wasted your time, made a phone call. He mentioned Bruce to another actor. And another. Each conversation was private, understated, specific. Each one followed the same pattern. Coburn described what he'd seen, what he'd felt, what he'd learned. He didn't oversell. He didn't need to. The authenticity of his experience was self-evident to anyone who knew him well enough to read his face when he talked about it. One by one, they came. To the small room. To the wooden dummy in the mirrors and the man who stood in the center of the space with his hands at his sides and said, "Try to touch me." The pattern repeated with each new student. They arrived skeptical. They expected karate, high kicks and breaking boards and the theatrical trappings of martial arts as American pop culture understood them. What they got was something they had no category for. A man who could read their bodies like text. A man who moved with an efficiency that made their years of training, their stunt experience, their physical confidence feel like a rough draft of something Bruce had already finished writing. They expected a performer. They met a philosopher. They expected to be entertained. They were educated. And each one left with the same disorientation that Coburn had felt after that first lesson, the sense that the world was slightly different than it had been an hour ago. That their own bodies contained capabilities they hadn't known about and limitations they hadn't suspected. That a small room on a side street in Los Angeles contained something that all of Hollywood's money and technology and expertise had failed to produce, the real thing. Bruce's client list grew. Not fast, he wasn't running a business in the conventional sense. He wasn't advertising. He didn't have a website or a brochure or a receptionist taking calls. He had a phone number that specific people gave to other specific people, and a small room that those people drove to, often in expensive cars that looked out of place on the street, and a rate of $275 an hour that nobody, not one person who walked through that door and experienced what was on the other side of it, ever questioned. The economics shifted. Bruce's income grew. Not to Hollywood levels, not yet, but to a level that provided stability. That allowed him to focus on his teaching and his development of Jeet Kune Do without the constant pressure of financial uncertainty. The irony was layered. The industry that wouldn't cast him was funding him. The system that couldn't see him was paying, through its most elite members, for the privilege of being seen by him. I want to stay with that irony for a moment because I think it reveals something about how influence actually works. Not through visibility. Not through marketing or self-promotion or the things that Hollywood understood and valued. Through undeniability. Bruce Lee, in his small room, was undeniable. You could ignore him from a distance, and most of Hollywood did. But if you walked through the door, if you stood in front of him, if you felt his hand read the intention in your shoulder before your own brain had finished forming it, you could not deny what he was. And you could not unknow it. That's what $275 bought. The inability to go back. The most invisible man in Hollywood was teaching the most visible men in Hollywood, and none of them could talk about it. Not because Bruce demanded secrecy. He didn't. But because how do you explain it? How do you tell your agent, your director, your co-star, that twice a week you drive to a side street and a 135-pound Chinese man shows you that everything you thought you knew about your own body is wrong? How do you say that in 1967 Hollywood, at a lunch where every face at the table is white and every assumption at the table is that power looks like you, large, Western, visible? You don't explain it. You can't explain it. You just go. And you leave the envelope on the shelf. And you come back on Friday. The club grew. And with it, something else grew, a network. A web of connections that linked Bruce Lee to the machinery of Hollywood through its most influential nodes. Coburn knew directors. Silliphant knew producers. Other students knew casting agents, studio executives, money men. None of them were actively campaigning for Bruce, not yet, not in any organized way. But Bruce Lee's name was now in rooms it hadn't been in before. Spoken by voices that those rooms listened to. Attached to descriptions that didn't fit any existing category and therefore couldn't be easily dismissed. The wall was still there. The casting offices still saw a small Asian man when they looked at Bruce Lee. The system still had no folder for what he was. But the wall now had doors, plural, and behind each one was a man who had stood in the small room and felt the ground shift beneath his assumptions. $275 an hour. That's what the invoice said. That's what Coburn wrote checks for, week after week, month after month, for years. But the invoice was a polite fiction. A number on a page that gestured at a value it couldn't represent. What Coburn actually received in those hours, what all of them received, was the experience of being wrong. Genuinely, fundamentally, uncomfortably wrong. Wrong about fighting. Wrong about the body. Wrong about the relationship between size and power, between visibility and value, between the performance of strength and the possession of it. And finding that being wrong was the beginning of something. Not the end. The relationship between Coburn and Bruce lasted from 1967 to 1973. 6 years. The world changed around them in those 6 years: Vietnam, the counterculture, the slow fracturing of the social certainties that had governed America since the war. And in their small, private way, these two men in a room were part of that fracturing. They were living proof that the hierarchies were wrong. That the categories were incomplete. That the biggest, most visible, most powerful man in a room might have less to teach than the smallest, most invisible, most overlooked one. Bruce went to Hong Kong. He made the big boss. Then Fist of Fury. Then Way of the Dragon. Then Enter the Dragon. The small man from the small room became the most famous martial artist the world had ever seen. The wall didn't just get a door, it came down. Not completely, not permanently, but in the space that Bruce Lee created, it came down far enough for the world to see through to the other side. Coburn watched this from inside the story. He'd been there before the fame, before the films, before the mythology hardened around Bruce like amber around an insect. He'd been there when Bruce was just a man in a room. A man with mirrors and a wooden dummy and a truth in his hands that the world wasn't ready to see. Coburn had been ready. That was his gift, not his size, not his fame, not his career. His gift was readiness. The willingness to walk through a door that didn't look like much from the outside and discover that the inside contained everything. Watch Coburn's films before 1967 and after. I've done this. I've watched them back to back, looking for the seam, looking for the moment where the training shows. It's subtle. Coburn was too good an actor to let the mechanics become visible. But it's there. In the way he holds a weapon, less theatrical, more functional. In the way he enters a room, his weight distribution is different, lower, more centered. In the way he moves during action sequences, the excess is trimmed, the movements are tighter, the body language has been edited by someone who understood that less is more in a way that Hollywood stunt coordinators had never quite grasped. Directors noticed. Not consciously, nobody said Coburn moves differently since he started training with that Chinese guy. But they felt it. They felt that his screen presence during physical scenes had acquired a gravity it hadn't had before. A groundedness. An authority that came not from size or volume but from the quiet efficiency of a body that had been retrained by the best. Stunt coordinators noticed. The good ones, the ones who understood the difference between what looks impressive and what is impressive, saw that Coburn's movement vocabulary had changed. That his punches were tighter. That his footwork was cleaner. That he had stopped performing violence and started, in some small but perceptible way, embodying it. None of them knew where it came from. None of them traced it back to the small room and the small man and the $275 on the shelf. It was a ghost influence, invisible, untraceable, everywhere. There is a photograph from 1973. I've seen it. Coburn is in it. The expression on his face is not the face of a movie star. It is not the face of a tough guy or a Hollywood alpha or a man who has spent his career projecting strength and confidence and the comfortable certainty that the world has been correctly organized with him near the top. It is the face of a man carrying something heavy. Something personal. Something that the camera has caught but the caption doesn't explain. I'm not going to tell you what that photograph shows. Not in this story. I've already said more than I intended to, and some things need to be earned by the full telling rather than hinted at in a summary. But I'll come back to it in a future story, when the timeline reaches the place where that photograph lives. What I will tell you is this. James Coburn, in a 1999 interview 2 years before his own death, was asked about Bruce Lee. By then, Coburn was 71. He'd had a career that spanned 5 decades. He'd worked with the greatest directors, the greatest actors, the greatest stunt professionals in the history of American cinema. He'd won an Academy Award for Affliction in 1998, a lifetime of craft finally acknowledged by the institution that had been happy to use it without honoring it. And when they asked about Bruce, the voice changed. That gravel-bottom drawl, the voice that had delivered lines in 100 films, the voice that had made women lean forward and men sit back, softened. Not with sadness, exactly. With something older than sadness. Something that had been carried for a long time and worn smooth by the carrying. The first time I saw Bruce do something real, not a demonstration, not a performance, something real, I understood that everything I thought I knew about fighting was wrong. And I'd been in this business for 20 years. He didn't specify what something real was. He didn't describe a corridor. He didn't mention a bodyguard. He didn't name a technique or a lesson or a moment. He used the word real twice, and the repetition was the tell. Real. The word he'd been circling since 1967. The word that had driven him to a side street, to a plain door, to a small room where a man half his size showed him that his whole life had been a beautiful, convincing, extraordinarily successful performance of a thing he'd never actually done. Coburn was the first. But he wasn't the last. Within a year of Coburn's first lesson, there was another name on Bruce's private list. A man even more famous. Even more competitive. Even more unwilling to be second best at anything. A man who didn't come to Bruce through Coburn, who came through a different door entirely, driven by a different need, carrying a different kind of hunger. His name was Steve McQueen. And his story with Bruce Lee is nothing like this one. But for now, for the end of this story, I want to go back to the room. The small room. The mirrors and the wooden dummy in the late afternoon light coming through the high window. The smell of wood and sweat and lemon floor polish. The 2 styrofoam cups of water on the shelf, next to an envelope that contains $275. 2 men. One tall, one not. One famous, one not. One the embodiment of what Hollywood valued, the other the embodiment of what Hollywood couldn't see. Standing 3 feet apart in a space where neither of those descriptions mattered. Where the only thing that mattered was the thing passing between them, the knowledge, the correction, the slow and patient transfer of a truth that had no language, that could only be felt in the muscles and the bones and the quiet rearrangement of everything you thought you knew. Coburn never explained to Hollywood why he went to that room. He never justified the money. He never argued with the gossip. He just went. Tuesday. Friday. Year after year. And he carried what he found there into every room he entered for the rest of his life, quietly, invisibly, the way Bruce had taught him to carry force. Not in the big, showy movements that audiences applaud. In the small, precise ones that change everything without anyone seeing how. $275 an hour. In 1967. For a man nobody in Hollywood could see, teaching things nobody in Hollywood could name, in a room nobody in Hollywood would have found without directions. And James Coburn, one of the most powerful men in the industry, a man who could have bought anything, learned from anyone, gone anywhere, drove to that room twice a week and left an envelope on a shelf and stood where a smaller man told him to stand. Because the thing in that room was real. And real, as Coburn learned, is the one thing money can't buy and fame can't replace and size can't intimidate. You can only stand in front of it. And be changed.